Well, hi, thanks for coming today. My name is Gina Grandi. I'm a professor in the theater and dance department at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina. I'm also the founder and the artistic director of the Bechtel Group, which is a New York City-based theater company that fosters writers who are writing for women. My illustrious panelist guests are all theater practitioners whose work that I personally admire and whose work has addressed equity, race, gender, sexuality, and ability. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then speak a bit more about what we are going to be chatting about here today. And let's start with Clay.
Hi, I want to thank Appalachian State Association, Gina Grandi, and also the Bechtel Group, which is a wonderful, wonderful organization and group which champions voices like mine. So thank you. I can tell you that I'm a playwright and composer. I focus on musicals, although I have some short works which are non-musical theater based. And I currently have 2 musicals in development, both of which center female characters and include voices and faces that may not always be celebrated. One, of course, Parallel Lines is currently in the festival stage and has received good feedback for its topics of sexual harassment, of course, plagiarism, things that weave in and out of academic experiences. And then the one that there's also comedy involved. I tend to take a subversive approach to really deep topics by infusing humor and really fleshing out characters' nuances.
And Madi. And you're muted. You're muted, Madi.
There we go. I'm Mariana Moneymaker. I go by Madi, and I know Gina through the Bechtel Group. I am one of the board members, and I first came to the Bechtel Group just to one of their meetings, and then got invited to do one of their 24-hour challenges, and it just went off from there. It's a great group. Definitely check us out. I've been writing for stage and screen for a while. I have an MFA through Lesley University for specifically screenplays. I am a fellow with the Writers Guild Foundation for veteran projects. I have several screenplays that have won awards. I've been a production supervisor for public access TV shows, where we would write segments, monthly segments for a magazine style show on a regular basis. We never missed a show, and we were broadcasting all 5 boroughs. Little celeb there was Laverne Cox was our host before Laverne Cox was Laverne Cox. She was just always so generous with her time, so it was nice. And when it comes to writing, I mainly I like writing about historical fiction. I also do a bit of issue plays kind of thing, but without making it feel like it's an issue. That's kind of, and I just like writing really diverse characters, and always infusing a bit of humor if I can in them. So.
Thank you. And Renee.
Hi, my name is Renee Flemings, and I came to writing by a different path. I started as an actor and began writing, basically writing solo shows, because I felt like as an actor, the roles that were available to me were extremely limited. And I got tired of being put in little boxes. So I started writing, but then eventually began writing plays that I realized weren't for me. They were for other actors, which was great. I met Gina and Madi through the Bechtel Group, and thank you for including me on this panel. I've been writing for quite a while, and as time has evolved, my role in theater has changed. I've writer, playwright, librettist. I've written the book and lyrics for a couple of musicals, one of which was in development at the end of 2019 and been on hold now. I've written numerous plays, been published a few times. I also this year added author, writing short stories of my first book, a collection of short stories, and filmmaker, adapting one of my short plays into a screenplay, and it's received a couple of awards. And so a lot of things: playwright, producer, director, actor, singer, songwriter, all kinds of things. And the types of, I'm really drawn to a mixture of things in terms of the things I'm interested in writing. And I really like to explore style in the way I write. How many ways can I tell the story? And it runs a gamut from historical based moments that I feel like have been kept hidden away, and I love to explore those and introduce those ideas to an audience. Everything from that to comedy to science fiction to just whatever's happening for me at the moment.
Thank you. So we'd also like to give a quick shout out and thank you to my colleague, Derek Davidson, who originally envisioned and proposed this panel discussion. So we're all here essentially to talk about our thoughts on the needs and the responsibilities of theater practitioners, directors, and educators when considering diversity, inclusion, and representation. It's important, we think, to be having these conversations, to be having them openly, to be having them bravely, and having them with grace, because no one, certainly none of us on this panel, can or should be called to speak on behalf of the population in general. And certainly none of us have definitive answers. And in the course of having these conversations and in our work to decolonize theater practices, and I mean we, the collective global we, are going to make missteps. We're going to make missteps that throw us off track in the moment, missteps we don't recognize till later. But as my colleague Clay said to me yesterday, theater is that space where we can learn about and from each other's stories. So that's the purpose of today's panel discussion. We are going to talk to each other about our experiences and our views around some of these overarching questions. And then we will open it up to questions from the guests about 20 minutes towards the end. So if something strikes you that you'd like to hear more about, please do jot that down so we can speak all together at the end. So, sorry, my cat is really excited about being involved in this panel. Really wants to see a lot of cat representation on stage. So just to start it off, kind of a general question, what stories are you personally excited about telling, and what kind of stories do you want to see more of in theater?
Okay, I guess I'll throw it out there. I am always, by virtue of my background, being a person of color, child of immigrants, multilingual, multicultural, I've always felt like a misfit, and in a place which likes to and leans upon labels in order to shortcut deeper understanding. So I have often found that my works tend to illuminate the misfit, meaning that they illuminate the person who is not easily categorized or who's not easily welcomed into their space. So I would say that tends to be a reoccurring theme, whether it is a graduate student who doesn't look like other graduate students or come from the same socioeconomic background, whether it's a female business owner, whether it is someone who is robbing the owner of a house. There's something, another one of my works. It's someone who is entering a space in which they're not welcomed or don't feel like they could be without without establishing their presence. It's more than just a fish out of water, though. I think we tend to reduce those experiences to, oh, you're just a fish out of water. Again, it's a label, but this is a character truly. If they don't even create a space in Act 1, they've possibly created this space in Act 2, but it's clear that there's no space for that person. It's never been thought about. So you will see the misfit pop up a lot, even more so than a misfit group. You'll see it embodied in one, usually female character. So that would be where I would start.
I guess I could add to that. Very similarly, I grew up around very, diverse group of women that were in charge and did what they did. And so that's why I write a lot of just women doing whatever they're doing, how they're doing it, no questions asked. And it's interesting around that, because then the conversation sometimes, at least in the writers groups I've been in, is the perspective tends to be interesting around it, because it's like, well, why didn't she analyze doing this or doing that? Like, no, she just needs to get through the world. Maybe her strategy is just to survive. She's not thinking about that or analyzing this. So those are the characters I tend towards. Like I have one play that's about a homeless woman veteran and her living on the boardwalk, but not that she's happy, but she is surviving and finding the happy moments in it. And I'm highlighting some of those while she also tells other stories through poetry. And it's also why I like historical fiction, is because I dig for the stories around women that people haven't ever seen a story about or haven't heard about. One that still in the development stage, and I'm still kind of hashing it out, is about Black queer women during the Renaissance, and how they had a whole street and whole clubs dedicated to them, and in their house parties, like they were just doing their thing. And even though, yes, they had this thing over their head that they can be arrested and they were still living life, and those are the kind of stories that I like to see and I like to tell.
As far as my writing is concerned, the kind of stories that I tend to tell, they go into different veins quite frequently. A lot, being a Black female, and I guess my past influences a lot of the stories I want to tell, because I grew up in a community where I was definitely a minority, meaning that I was one of maybe 6 students of color in an entire school district. And those stayed with me as I grew older, some of those experiences and the biases that I encountered. So a lot of the work I've done deals with understanding the many facets of a person. That's where I began, with exploring that instead of digging deep, being able to understand the character, why they're making the choices they're making, and looking beyond just the labels, the categories that are stuck on them. And as of late, though, because of our recent political history, I've been really interested in looking at circumstances and situations that affect people of color and LGBTQ persons, just the community, just because I feel like a lot of those stories are kind of buried away. I'm working on a piece now that's specifically focused on a missing child, a Black child. And the reason why is because I kept hearing, reading, and discovering these stories about how the population is treated differently when the child of color ends up missing. And I really wanted to highlight that. So I'm interested in seeing stories that do speak to elements of different communities that aren't just, always the same old story. I'd like to see what's discovered that's new. And the musical that I've been working on has to do with a story, an actual historical event that it was so unfathomable to me, and no one's ever talked about it. And I felt like people don't know this. I never heard of this. So I like discovering those historical gems and dealing with what's going on in our real lives. And then, along with all of that, pulling back labels and digging into what's really going on, looking at the minutia of someone's struggle.
Right. So on that kind of looking outward more globally, American theater is starting to finally really talk seriously about how to make their work more inclusive and more representative. And what do you personally think is high priority when planning a performance season, when creating new work, when just looking at our organizations and their work?
I would say, looking at a season as a whole, what I would love to see is an organic, holistic approach that shies away from the here's our one LGBTQ plus work. Oh, we got to get a Black work in there. Let's do a Latino. Let's check that box. That's what I would like to see us shy away from. I'd like to, knowing that there is interest in inclusivity now, I would love to see something that maybe included a through line of a sort, so that it's not just, oh, it's February, let's dust off whatever it is that is palatable and non-offensive and just ethnic enough. I would love to see, even if there were, I don't know if curating a season around a theme that happened to weave through questions of gender, questions of equality, questions of socioeconomic struggle, because so many themes that on their face do not involve race, ethnicity, gender. So many themes that do not on their face involve that actually do involve that. So if you talk about poverty, or if you talk about housing, or if you discuss supermarkets, or if you even discuss sports, things that on their face may not seem to trend in those ways. All those themes are there, right? So I think being a little more nuanced in that approach might create a season that then does include more of these conversations. You're not always going to have a show or a cast that on its face reflects what you're trying to promote or trying to bring forward. But by having those themes and then really drilling down on them, maybe we can start working toward that.
I completely agree with you. I feel like the idea of a thematically connected season, actually even looking at it as a form of inquiry, exploring a question and looking at how that is explored through plays, through theatrically, and that opens it up, I think, to new works and even classic works looked at in a different way through a different lens. Um, and those questions are things that I think can be connected to what is the goal of that organization. Like, what are they looking at in terms of evolution, in terms of growth, in terms of development around ideas of, see, I think to me, in a way, inclusivity is almost a narrowing term, because I think it makes us think in a particular way, as opposed to opening up our eyes and seeing what is organically and inherently present, as Clay said, in theater, you know. And even if you're looking at a classic play and you explore a little bit of some element of how does this character change? If this character, how does it impact the story? If this character who was traditionally played by a white male is now played by a black male or a female or a someone that is outside that particular box that we expect, what happens to those themes? I mean, theater is an opportunity to explore, to take risk, to challenge the status quo, the present thinking. So I think when looking at a season and looking at a line of inquiry that drives that season, you can explore all the different ways to facilitate that deep exploration.
And I would add, to go off of Renee, that exploration. I want to think and focus more of even further back than that, of like theater in every aspect of it, and where the money comes from and how it gets distributed. Because these seasons don't just, happen only through the program and the organization. It happens because of the funding and the people that they bring together. And so who's at those tables? The funders that they're bringing in, are they only, white cis males? When there could be, really high, are people approaching Oprah about theater? Are people approaching I forget his name, Tyler Perry, about doing theater? Like, where are the funding sources coming from? Because when some of that also changes, inherently the table changes, and who's at the table, who's writing, who's acting, who's doing the lights. And I think one of the best examples of that is the fortunate opportunity that Lin-Miranda had with In the Heights. Like, watching their reunion video, and how the actors and the cast and the crew, like when they first got into the theater, and they were like, oh my God, this feels like a family. Because it was a whole different dynamic of people that they had around them, that were building this thing together, and were given the opportunity. So we could have more moments of that in the storytelling around. And the other thing is, In the Heights was new work. Like, it was completely new work. He had only done it in his high school before it ever got to the theater. So that kind of that opening of really wanting to take what Renee said and putting it throughout the entire system, where then you're you'll naturally be looking for those new works. Just by making those changes. That would be my appeal to thinking about theater and how a season can get built.
And this is not exactly following on the season itself, but I find it really interesting and really instructive that Lin-Manuel actually brought in a cultural consultant for In the Heights. So, there wasn't that, that presumption of, oh, this is my neighborhood, I know this. He brought in a colleague who she read through and said, Is this really true to the character? Is this what they would do? Is this what they would say? And really strengthen the female characters in there. So, you know, just because we have the same backgrounds, even, we can even be informed by that. So yeah, really interesting.
Well, I love when you say that, that makes me think about that idea of accountability and what you're putting out there as an artist, you know, as well as needing to appreciate the fact that there is so many different personalities and different, you know, we don't know that all people do this. And, you know, all people who are, you know, people from Washington Heights or all people from Harlem do this. But the idea of establishing an accountability that as a writer, you have to think about. And I think that's important as well. You know, I love that.
Well, that leads me to ask, so I teach at App State, and it is a largely white student body. And one of the ongoing conversations that we're having in our department and that I've been having with colleagues who are doing regional work is how do we make sure that our students, our actors, our company, we are reading, we're experiencing, we're performing inclusive representative theater without appropriation, without diversity tourism, and without tokenizing our handful of actors of color, actors who speak another language. What are your thoughts on kind of this new generation of theater makers and what we can be thinking about when working with groups that specifically racially, ethnically are not diverse in terms of thinking about theatrical diversity?
Well, you know, we talked about this. I don't know. I think my approach is maybe a little more, I don't know if the word is open, and than maybe the current zeitgeist, the current environment. I was speaking with a playwright a couple of years ago who cringed at the thought of, you know, her high school performing Once on This Island. And as I spoke with her, I said, you know, where else are they going to be in touch with those themes? I would rather see, if they took on something like that, that they maybe brought someone in to really discuss what we were discussing, you know, discuss the fact that this is not simply the story of a girl or about colorism. It's going back into the impacts of slavery on not only one island, but it's a mirror on what happened across the Western Hemisphere, where you have French aristocrats putting the children of their raped slaves in charge once they leave, once they no longer find the land and the profits to be worth the cost of their presence, or worth the cost of their attention, you know, of what happened to darker skinned women of the time, what happened to entire populations that descended from the hundreds of thousands of slaves that were brought over from Haiti. It's not enough to say, well, you're going to be the Creole ones, and so we'll put you in a pink dress, and then you're going to be the slaves, you know, former slaves, so we're going to put you in a blue dress, and now we're going to put on a show. That's completely, in any era, unacceptable. What seems to be unanswered, if not the answer, is to say, let's not completely cut ourselves off from stories that may broaden our horizons in a deep and permanent way. Let's not keep ourselves from something just because it may cause controversy, or it may make someone mad, but let's figure out a way to do this the right way. You know, how do we get to these answers? How do we learn? Do we do talkbacks? Do we, do we read beyond the pages of the libretto? What do we need to do? Because there are going to be environments and in counties where there are very few people of color. And so to take that away and say, well, then because there are no people of color, we're never going to do these stories. And the only way you're going to broaden your viewpoint is to leave, go away, which is what a lot of people have done. You know, they don't feel like their questions are being heard. They don't feel like they're understanding. They've got TV or they've got the internet, and you can only get what you can get from that. We all know that what the question you ask is as important as what you find. So if we don't at least say, here's maybe a way that we can expand this space with the actors you have, then we're just cutting things off again. And I just don't know that we're learning as much. I know that that's not the only answer, but to say maybe it is an answer for that, and to at least explore the possibility might be a choice.
You know, I have to say that sometimes I've seen productions of plays that, you know, like you know, there was a huge uproar, and understandably, there was production of From the Mountaintop, where Dr. King was played by a white man, a white actor. And I think you have to, what's important to me is looking at what is the integrity of the play in terms of the content. Yes, a little while, you know, a few moments ago, I spoke about non-traditional casting. However, I feel like it depends on the piece. And in exploring a question and a response to your question, Gina, you know, this may seem way outside the box, but, you know, when I started thinking about this question, I was like, is there an answer to that maintains the integrity? Like, it's very clear. You do not non-traditionally cast an August Wilson play. You just don't. You know, his estate would not support that whatsoever. But way outside the box, I wonder, I don't know this is an answer, but I wonder if there is something with digging deep into those, again, looking at something as an inquiry, digging deep, and students being able to create something of their own through devising, through writing, that builds upon those themes that are in the plays that they're studying, that really holistically and organically connects the students of color within that, or taking away a way of looking at one of those pieces and shifting it through a prism that allows a stylized approach so that you can study the play and you can begin to explore elements of that play and the themes of that play with who's available. Again, like I said, I know that's a truly difficult question to answer because there's checks and balances.
Yeah, as I've been thinking about this, it's like all of the above, what everybody has said. And one of the things that I heard was the cutting off. And so immediately I go into the work that I do outside of theater and writing is I work at nonprofits, and I work for, I do digital communications for LGBT human rights. And also right now I'm working with the mayor's office at the 17 NYCHA houses, helping to reimagine what public safety looks like. And one of the biggest things that we talk about is trust and community, right? And when you talk about cutting off, is there an opportunity, and I don't know the university system at all, but is there an opportunity in that regional sense that you can be more networked with all the universities around you? So then it's not so much of students leaving or going here or wanting to, that they all feel connected and maybe even part of the process of creating theater. Maybe it's a time for us to, in the creation of it, open it up a bit more, where do something like what we do at the Bechtel group, where during table reads, maybe we invite public or other universities to come in and watch and give their feedback and thought about how you might be working on this. And that, I think, naturally then opens up to this discussions that both of you have been mentioning, like in the talkback sense, which starts with the students themselves. But I think also thinking about the writer and the people performing it. I mean, because how does, you know, like I always I've written a few plays around trans characters, and I usually try to put forth the ones that are a little bit more fun, because some of the more issue ones that I have, I don't always. I know that a lot of the actors that I know that are trans, you know, they have their own experiences and trauma that they're dealing with, and to have them act then in a play and have to pull on that every time, I'm always cautious about that, and I try to think about that. And so I don't have an answer for that, and maybe that's just something that'll sit in a drawer. But I don't know. Those are things that I think about when I hear this conversation. It's kind of like all the sides of it, not just the audience and who's going to sit in there, but in the process of making theater, how can it be, you know, more networked and more horizontal, so that you know, when you say holistic, you're actually doing holistic. I don't know. That's just my thought.
I love that idea. I love that idea of collaborating between student groups, because I think so often, you know, you've got a company or a troupe and they're tackling this and they think that, oh, wow, even though you know you're not the first, you're thinking, oh, wow, we're the first, or wow, you know, we're all alone in this. And sometimes it does help to bring in another group or say, you know, how are you approaching this? What are your thoughts on the theme? You know, you're running the lines, you're doing, you know, reading your sides, doing the table read, and what are your, you know, how do you feel? A lot of it is, how do you feel about our approach to this, how we see this, where we're coming from, what we're bringing to it or not bringing to it, the time, the setting in which this is placed, the writer. You know, it's so funny. You know, Renee, you mentioned August Wilson, and I know, if you remember the uproar over Edward Albee and Virginia Woolf 4 or 5 years ago, you know, and the estate was adamant, that's got to be a blue-eyed character. George is not going to be of any type of ethnicity, you know. And I thought, you know, well, then are we just never going to have Virginia Woolf on stage, you know? Like, what are the answers?
I know,
So,
it's such a dicey situation. It really does get into some very deep political, you know, like shady areas that it's hard to navigate. You know, because I there's certain plays, and maybe I have, you know, I think there's something to be said for acknowledging one's own biases about things. Like, there are certain things where I'd be like, well, why can't Virginia Woolf be done, you know, non-traditionally? But then if you said we're going to do piano lesson non-traditional, I'd be like, wait, no, you know. So it's like you know, I have to acknowledge that there's a certain conceit around some of these, what's acceptable and what's not, that it gets really bizarre and unanswerable, I think, you know.
We're also like only speaking to the US, but because I've worked internationally, I think about like um, territories like Puerto Rico and Guam, right, where the people obviously are, most of the characters will have accents, or
Right.
they'll translate it to Spanish, right, to play it at the University of Puerto Rico, or out in Guam. Almost everybody on the island is of Polynesian descent, right? So then they're going to bring that aspect to even the classics that we consider classics, right? If they wanted to do an August Wilson play, I don't know how that would look on the island of Guam or Fiji or anywhere else, you know. So I don't know. It's so interesting when you just start building it out.
Right.
Yeah.
That is a really big question, because it's like when you come to the classics, I have to admit, personally, when it comes to the classics, sure, non-traditionally cast, I love it, mix it all up. But then when you start talking about, I mean, like, could you do a play like Pipeline can only be done because, and I think maybe that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. What are the specifics that are impacting the dramatic arc of the character that impact the story? You know, would it have the same impact if the mother and the son were not Black? Do you know what I mean? Would the story be the same story?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all. That was my question. You know, it's like, it's something that may be another layer in terms of looking at that idea of what plays do you bring into a season. If you're going to look at, we have X amount of students of color who can play this role. Can we play this? Can we present this without it, diluting the author's intent in telling this story?
So I find that really interesting, but I want to go back to Guam for a second. I actually, honestly, I would welcome an August Wilson play being done in Guam. And part of the reason is that as someone who is Black with Hispanic background also, and from an immigrant family, I know, or I have heard how other groups who come to America misunderstand the specifically African American experience. And I would love to have a group tackle that and start getting that new perspective in there. If there's ever a group that is so rich and yet is so underrepresented in so many ways because of mainstream media, let's talk about it, you know, TV, movies, that is a voice I would love to see people say, oh, wow, wait, what? Oh, light bulb, you know? So yeah, Guam, bring it on, do Fences.
I actually think Fences would be a great play to do because the themes of it relate. I lived in Guam for a few years, and the themes relate to the people and living there in so many ways. I mean, Guam is, you know, only exists as part of America because it was colonized, right? So that experience and living is there to be related. Yeah, I can totally see it. But you know, I don't like the but I don't know. It would be something that we wouldn't necessarily see here. They'd probably never make the news. No, there would be no controversy on it.
But see, that's
cool, where it's at. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's so funny. We want theater to be a safe space, and as soon as somebody explores and says, "I'm coming to this with my whole heart," and I want to bring this story to life, all of a sudden there's a reporter at the door saying, so it's are you fully invested? Are you bringing this? Is there a space for that to happen? You know, I look at even Pipeline, I'm like, yes, it should be a Black mom and a Black son. But then I look at other stories where the mother and son dynamic is so strong, and I'm like, you know, let's think about it. Let's think about what that really means, you know? So, you know, those are all questions that are okay to ask. If we're creating a space for creativity and knowledge and integrity and new voices, then maybe that's an okay question to at least ask.
Yeah.
I
agree with that too. Yeah.
I think a couple of you, all of you have said at some point, this idea of networking, this idea of looking holistically, and this idea of connections. And I think in our area, in our region, that's something that's really important. I think it's true across the country. But the idea that we're going to have to put in the work to make those connections. And I'm thinking about however many years ago when the Kilroy list started, when theater companies were saying, well, we would have plays by women, but we just don't, there aren't any. And so this group started a list that said, great, here's 100 plays written by women over the past year that you could do in your season, here you go. And I think that a default, just speaking from my own experience, having worked in different areas in the country, people work with what they know, people work with the people they know. It can be a very insular field. So if we're looking at how are we inclusive in Appalachia, what resources exist here, and how do we put in the work to bring in, Clay, like you said, a cultural consultant? How do we actively seek out playwrights? There are a lot of playwrights out there. I feel like the New York theater scene gives us the impression that there are 5 playwrights in the whole country. and the canon that we teach in university levels, same thing. But there are a lot of writers and a lot of creators, and that it's going to be contingent on us to do that work and to find those resources and bring them in. I really love that. I love that conversation about like who's at the table and who are you bringing into the table. And Clay, you and I were talking about missteps and what you were just saying about being under scrutiny. And I think there's a real fear in companies. I know that I'm a middle-aged cisgender white woman. I feel a lot of pressure to not mess up, and because I'm part of the oppressive demographic that has existed in theater for so long. And finding, have I done my research? Have I brought in people? Am I trying to do this by myself? Because that's where I feel like it becomes inappropriate. Who am I bringing in? I want to go back to something that I think, Renee, you were saying, Nadi was saying, about trauma stories. And this is a conversation that I feel like has come up quite a bit, and looking at who's telling what stories and what stories are being told. And this idea of mining intersectionality for trauma and how I have students who will say, I'd love a play with a gay protagonist where they don't die at the end. Can you help me? I said, nope, because I'm looking too. But looking at, again, what stories do we want to see on stage and what stories do we want to tell? And I didn't know if you wanted to talk any further about, when we're thinking about representation, what are we representing? And what boxes are we considering?
Yeah, I was sitting in a meeting with the theater team at Hunter through Adrian, Adrian and Gina. And one of the things that they mentioned that they wanted to do for the series that they were working on was that they wanted to be a celebration. They were tired. I mean, they were tired of, the stories that were basically just based on their experience. And that's actually something I also heard from like activists who would, which is also, I think, a form of storytelling in theater in a way, who would have to tell their stories at the UN only based on their experience. And there would never be questions about them as a holistic person. I think that's when you hear that over and over again, then it only becomes about this situation and this thing, and not about the actual people and person and them as a whole person beyond that one event or experience. Because we're all so many, so many things. I'm Chinese, Puerto Rican, bisexual, like all of the above. I could check any boxes on the diversity um, diversity wheel if you're counting that way. But like everyone said, labels. Let's try to. How do we open those up? I don't know. And it's also like in doing those, like the players, the crew, the people, like how are they experiencing this as they see it over and over and over again every night when you're telling these stories. Same thing in movies, right? You choose to put a scene in there that's that deep. You have a whole cast and crew that are going to do at least 20 takes of that. What does that mean to do that scene 20 takes? I don't know. So yeah, it's I would like to see more celebratory stories, or even within the scope of that story, that it doesn't only. I mean, there was a whole season of 13 Reasons Why that just focus on this very specific kind of event or situation, right? But maybe there's ways to tell the stories that include the joyous moments, right? To go with, because even in trauma, we can find humor, but it takes, I think, the experience of the writer and the team and the people that you bring into to kind of find where you can have moments of happiness in that. I don't know. That's my thought.
It's really funny. I totally agree with you. And now here's something else. I know I very thinly acquainted with a playwright who has a musical coming out about a love story between a Black man and a Black woman in Harlem Renaissance. And I think they own a dance studio or something like that. He is having the hardest time trying to place it in a stage because everyone is telling him, even though it's well into development, that it's not deep enough. It doesn't include, I don't know, someone on a banjo, and it doesn't include, someone's son getting shot, and doesn't include, I don't know, whatever else. And he's having a really hard time. Yeah. And he said, but what about Aladdin and Sleeping Beauty and, Mamma Mia and all these other things that don't include trauma? Why can't you have people of color on a stage just being alive? It's almost like it's a requirement that those deep moments and that those traumatic experiences be a part of the othered experience. And it's really a shame. I've got, Gina, you're aware of my work, Stretch, which hasn't quite gotten that type of pushback, but it's about it's literally like a Zumba class and a yoga class and, and the people who lead those, and there's conflict, but it's all wrapped in humor. And then underneath you've got questions of gender and female business owners and regenerating communities and what does that mean? And outsider, and all of these things, but they're all underneath. And I almost feel that, what gets the blood going in the mainstream, in the gatekeepers is, oh, I want to see the pain. Well, we don't always want to have the pain. We want to live our lives, And so it's a question of the breathing, we want to breathe. We want our characters to breathe. We want our characters to be that 360. And yet there seems to be this, a little bit of pushback sometimes.
Yeah.
I seem to, it's interesting you say that, because just recently I've noticed that some of the submissions for plays from people of color, especially Black playwrights, they're like, but we want it to be joyous. We want to celebrate Black love. We want to celebrate Black joy. And it's interesting that it's something that has to actually be said. And even though I do know that my plays do involve drama, some trauma, there's been a pull lately for me to, it doesn't end in that place. It doesn't end in in the, the traumatic, everything is dissolved and it's all over, and, pounding the chest and everything. I feel like that's the thing that I like to see is I think part of it for me is seeing people go through their struggle and survive and come out like, I did it, or I've done this. And those are the stories I like to see, as well as celebrations of life without the stereotypical tropes that we've seen for decades in terms of, people of color. It has to be this thing. And I have heard that before too. It was interesting. I just had a reading of a new piece this past week. And one young woman said to me, well, as a Black woman in 2021, she would not be, it was like she wanted the character to be very, she it was like she has to be a strong fighting Black woman. And I'm like, why?
Yeah.
Why? Not everybody is. There are a lot of people who we fall. I have always embraced the idea of the many facets of people of every color and gender and whatever. And once we start putting people into those categories, and what I love to see is a story on stage on film that makes me see someone in a different light. That's what I want to see. And that gives me joy, because I'm like, oh my God, it was great. They did. Yes. That I love.
Yeah. On the flip side of that, like, this has got me thinking about like what would I write and what would I try to do that would be completely different. And I actually like things like Silence of the Lambs and some of those I love what is it? Lovecraft Country and the whole dark series of those. And I've thought about writing one from as a lesbian serial killer. But I don't know. I don't know if I want to put that out into the world because of how it might be perceived and taken in certain circles. So I don't, yeah, this is a tough question sometimes in some things, like when you're trying to think outside the box and come up with different ideas. A person of color that's a lesbian and that's a serial killer, doesn't that kind of already play to like what some of the horrors and fears that people have already?
Okay, so I was actually discussing with someone who's not a writer. This was a couple of nights ago. We were talking about a TV show that's on now. It's called Bob Hearts Abishola, and it centers a Nigerian immigrant woman in America and her experiences. The character herself is very strong and very firm and very, very rigid in many ways. And I was telling this person, I said, the only way that she could be on there without everyone who watches thinking, oh, that all Nigerians are like that, is that there's another role. Her cousin, who is fun and bubbly and a little, adventurous and is everything that she's not. And just by centering this person and then juxtaposing her against this other person from the same place, now we've broken the stereotype. And whenever people tell me, oh, I don't want to put this person in a bad light, what that tells me is it's because there aren't enough people like that out there. Let's get more people out there. I want to see a lesbian serial killer who's like amazing and smart. You got to be something to be a serial killer. You have to think in an interesting way. I want to see that. But I don't want that to be the only lesbian character that I see out there. I want to see, not even in the same show, you could have 2 or 3 different people with different facets in it, but outside of that, because what we've always come up with is, you do someone, I have a professor who's maybe not perfect, but she's the only one. And that's kind of the point. She's the only one, but now she really is the only one. So you can't have a character who's undignified and not a hero and not strong and not brave and not a completely one-sided perfect person. because sometimes that's the only one people will see. We need more out there. And then we can all be humans. We can all be ourselves.
I remember a long time ago, I agree with you. I got so much pushback because some of my earlier plays, the black, you know, they were around, the cast were mainly black. They were not upstanding characters, all of them. And I got a lot of pushback. And what I realized, and it's exactly what you were saying, it was like, there's not enough other out there to balance it out, you know. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because as a writer, I know that sometimes I do think of that. And I know other writers that think of that as well. We've had these conversations about, well, I want them to be blah, 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 but if I put that out there, man, I'm going to get so much grief. I can't do it. I don't want to fight that fight. And it's like, but you should, but the thing is all of that exists in our universe. All of these things exist. And that's one of the things that I used to always get very upset about. It's like, you know, this is not going to sound right when I say this, but what I used to always say is, why can't Black people be bad?
Yeah.
Well, I think I don't want to cut you off, but I know we're running
Okay.
short on time. But I think, and I want to make sure we have time for at least one question. And I think that this is the conversation that theater makers and practitioners need to be having across the board. Like, how do we get into a room, sit down, let's throw out all of these questions and thoughts, let's bring in stakeholders, let's reach out who is a part of this community and have these larger conversations. So I think what's really interesting is there's the ideal world we want, and then there's the work that we have to do to get to that ideal world that we want. And what do we need to do to ensure that that comes true? So I think we have time for one question, perhaps. I don't know if there's anything burning in the attendees. If not, I can give us a question to close out. But is there Jessica? Thank you, Jessica. I don't know how to unmute you. Oh, you can do that. Good.
I can do it. It's okay. But I was wanting to return to Maddie's discussion of Guam and thinking too about like the indigenous population of Guam, like the Chamorro people, and how would casting indigenous and non-indigenous, you know, sort of Guam populations or peoples, how would that affect maybe how we would present August Wilson's plays? It's kind of a weird question, but you know, having read some of August Wilson's work and also studying like Chamorro populations, I wonder like what sort of new readings or understandings, you know, could come from some of that casting.
I feel like I want to teach a course on that now.
Yeah. I think part of it would be first, from the little bit, I didn't have kids, but I had friends who had kids on the island, and I, you know, friends that still live on the island. And first off would be just to teach, like their curriculum is very similar to in the States. And so like, you know, in bigger cities, you can usually find August Wilson. In smaller cities, it may not ever been read by anyone in an English class or anything like that, right? So their familiarity, even with the text in and of itself, would be the first step, is the introduction, right? And then what themes that they can, like from the themes, how would they build out a production from there? Because I think as far as like, if you're thinking in terms of experience, or are you thinking in terms of skin color, right? In skin color, it's going to be a lighter production all around. Right? We're brown people. Like that was the first time I actually learned and started using the term, because I was frequently mistaken for Chamorro, is that, you know, we're just brown people, but just getting through the world kind of thing, right? And then there's but in terms of experience, there's tons of things I think in fences alone, and how they're just surviving on the island, and getting through their day, that I think would bring a lot to the story in and of itself. And yeah, so I think it's kind of like, both of those things. But I think first off, I mean, for Guam specifically, it would be introducing even just playwrights that aren't from the classics. Like, I don't think outside, like, Puerto Rico might have more access. I think Puerto Rico actually focuses on even Latinx writers, you know. So I think they have a bit more. But from my experience of living in Guam, they kind of used what was brought to them and what's there. And they do culturally tell their own stories, and they bring that to the table, which we don't ever get to see, which would also be nice, is if we got to see their story. Because there's some beautiful stories on the island, around the Tatamona, and I don't know, just in general. So I mean, it's one of those things where the networking then comes into play, right? Can we connect theater all across the world? There's that theater group uh, that brings Palestinians and Israelis together to create theater, right? So if they can do it, we can do it.
We have, I think, 3 minutes. Anyone have a 3-minute question? No pressure to do a question. Well, then I will close us out with a quick response question. Also, no pressure. But succinctly, what do you see as the role of regional theater in Appalachia, in terms of making an impact on the larger dramatic landscape of the country?
I think that's telling the stories of Appalachia. Simply, I mean, like, what are the stories that we don't know in New York City or in California or Chicago that come from there? I'm all about the storytelling.
I second that. That's immediately where I went to. I want to know more about Appalachia.
Yeah, I want to see the layers beyond what we've been told. I think that we have a poverty of information when it comes to the areas of our country that are not always on TV. And I would like to see I'd like to see the region be bold. If you have stories that make us uncomfortable, that make us feel, that make us open our eyes, open our hearts, bring those, please. Yeah.
And please include Indigenous. I'm like, especially in that area. Yeah, for sure.
That's just what I was just getting ready to say. It's like, actually, from Appalachia all across this country, the Indigenous people's stories, we need that. And as well as going beyond the stereotypes of what we've seen in the films and movies, because that's what we see most of the time. Those are the stories.
Yeah, and people think, oh, well, what if it's not good enough, if it's not as good as Hamilton? I don't know anything that's really as good as Hamilton. Just get it on the stage, get it out there, get it in the development process.
Yeah. Well, there's that aspect of theater that is play, and I think we have to remember that, right? We call it a play for a reason. Let's play. Let's play by telling stories.
Yep.
Oh, that's such a lovely note to conclude on. Because I think, look at that, right on time. At least according to my time. I hope my clock's accurate. But thank you, guests, for coming today. It was really lovely to have you. Thank you, Madi and Renee and Clay. This is, as I've said, this is my favorite thing to do, is just to sit around, talk about theater, listen to other people's. And these are issues that are really dear to my heart, coming from having lived in San Francisco, having lived in New York, and now living in Boone, and thinking about my students and the next generation of theater makers and the stories that they have to tell and what stories I want them to experience and to see, and what regionally, what a wealth of stories we have to offer, and how do we put in the work to be responsible, to be inclusive, and to create that world where we can tell all the stories because everybody is there. So thank you again. Thank you for being here. I don't know how to end. Have a rest of your Friday and weekend.
Thanks for
Thank you.
inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Also, Jessica, if she has any, wants to reach out to me about Guam or anything, I can, do you have any more other questions? I know I took a minute on that.
And if you have, yeah, absolutely, reach out to me through Gina if you have any additional comments, questions. I'll be happy to answer.
Same here.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's nice to meet you, Clay.
Nice meeting
Yes,
you.
thanks.
Absolutely, Renee, MJ. Bye, Gina. Thank you again.
Bye, Gina. Thank you.
Bye.